January Decentralized Web Meetup. And I'm going to bring on Mr. Dale.
So I had this PhD student wanted to interview me about the history of web archiving and the things she didn't understand. She said, so this decentralization, this clearly wouldn't help you, would it? I was like, oh, you don't get it, do you? Okay, so I was like, wow, here's my opportunities. I tried to say, why did the Internet Archive really spend a lot of time and effort diving into trying to support the decentralized web? And so a few things. The idea of the web is it's just not good enough yet. It's got some real problems to it. Snowden really pointed them out in a really sort of visceral kind of like, oh my God, we can't ignore this anymore kind of way of, it's not private. You can go and watch sort of everybody that's going to a particular website. It's not reliable in the sense that somebody can go and pull something down that's down for everybody. It's not like in the old days when libraries would publish books that goes into lots of libraries. If the one library burns down, it's okay still. You get it from the others, and no, poof, it's gone. And so it's not reliable. So and it didn't evolve as fast as it could. You couldn't get paid by being on the net, right? There's advertising in that. We know where that goes. It doesn't go anywhere good. So we thought, why don't we do it and try to build a little bit better web, and let's build some things into it, like the archiving process. Right? Tim Berners-Lee did this really amazing thing with the web. It was very, very simple, but it was kind of simple. And one of the problems of it is websites don't act like Gits. Right? You can't go and see past versions. You can't fork them. You can't. There's all sorts of things you can't do because with these websites. So what if we got our chance to go and do things differently and better? And so the idea of using some of the tools we've got now is JavaScript, which is a pretty freaking amazing mechanism moving code that actually runs at computer speeds, even though you've just downloaded it into your browser. There's encryption, which is pretty freaking impressive. Yes, we can throw in a little bit of blockchain, but I don't think we need that much blockchain for actually doing most of the decentralized web. That we have these technologies to be able to go and pull off doing something pretty big and neat. So what the Internet Archive is trying to do is some of these meetups. There's going to be a decentralized web camp this summer, which you guys are all invited to. We just have to get Wendy to tell us when the date is.
I will.
Okay, you're going to tell us when the date is. Okay, it's good. It's going to be. She's going to tell us soon. But it's going to be in July, I think. Late July. And it's going to be in a beautiful mushroom farm in Portola. Excuse me, Pescadero, which is just on the other side of Woodside.
Half Moon Bay.
So Half Moon. Okay, this is your okay. So anyway, you should come. It's sometime in July, so we're doing these sort of gatherings for this, and we're also trying to make the Internet Archive but decentralized. So we want everything but decentralized. And so we thought, why don't we go and start with ourselves? So how can we make it so that the two use cases that we're really working towards, and we're going to be able to demo it in the summer at camp, as best I can tell. One is to try to help people that are in internet challenged environments because they're either offline, or it's expensive, or it's censored, that they can't get to things they want to be able to get to. Can we make it so that that works really well with the Internet Archive's content? The other is if you want to go and serve a big hunk of the Internet Archive and make sure that it is running someplace else, that you're not just going and grabbing and holding it, but you're also serving it yourself. So by going and using the Internet Archive and putting a big hunk, I don't know, a terabyte, a petabyte, whatever it is, on your servers, that then it starts to make it much more reliable, and lots of copies keep stuff safe. So that's the Internet Archive but decentralized. And what I'd love to see for next summer at camp is more blank but decentralized. All the services that we know and love, but decentralized. Can we, that's what I'd love to see. So thank you very much for coming, and that's the rationale for the Internet Archive being involved in this. If you'd like us to play a different role towards promoting this in some other way, please let us know. We're absolutely here for you. Thank you.
Jonathan Doughton to come up, and he's going to be talking about something real special. But before we do that, Jonathan, while you're getting set up, I'll tell you a little bit about Jonathan. I basically stalked this man because we were going to do this Decentralized Web Summit. And how many of you have ever watched HBO's Silicon Valley? Right? So you've seen Richard Hendricks and like that VC guy says, well, what would you really do, Richard? What would you really do right now? Tell me right now. And he said, well, I'd build a decentralized internet. You know, when we carry these things in our pockets that have all this capacity and, you know, and he gave the most cogent and visionary 1-minute description of the decentralized internet and web that I've ever heard. I thought, I need to find the guy who came up with that. Well, this is the guy.
All of the team are really smart guys and gals. So.
And he's going to be teaching a class on the history of the internet at Stanford in April, if you go to Stanford MBA school. And also, he is working with the Shoah Foundation at USC to use blockchain.
We'll see.
We will see.
Yes, we will discuss.
So he's here to share this really interesting project called D-Testimonial about using an immutable ledger for genocide. So Jonathan, take it away.
All right, thank you. It's really great to be back, and Wendy absolutely stopped me and absolutely changed so much for me because attending the Decentralized Web Summit in August was a real Kickstarter for some ideas for myself. With the show, we've already since kind of doubled down on this idea that like there is no choice. Like, we have to have a decentralized web. So we're trying our best to kind of tell that story through humor. I think this is kind of the Jonathan Swift of the tech industry. But it got me thinking about another project that has been near and dear to my heart, and so I thought I would talk to you guys about it today. We are in the process of bringing together a cohort of folks, so Wendy thought, oh, what better opportunity than to speak to some folks who care about this. So there's a number of people that have come forward, but we haven't launched anything public quite yet about our partnerships. So in a sense, now's the time to get involved. So just as a way of introduction, in addition to doing the show, I worked at a virtual reality startup that had incredible technology for rendering. And I put together a slate of projects. And the one project that I think I'm the most proud of is this project that I produced with a bunch of really great VR companies called The Last Goodbye. And the idea was that we were asked by this foundation called the Shoah Foundation to go with them to Poland to a concentration camp and take a bunch of photos using a process of photogrammetry, be able to virtually reconstruct this camp. And so the process was extraordinary because we not only got the camp, but then we were able to layer in the testimony of a survivor of that camp. And then with virtual reality, be able to essentially holographically layer in this testimony. And the project was extraordinary because you can literally walk around in VR in this horrendous place and hear his stories. So it was quite moving. And when we finished, I asked them, I said, what are you going to do with the data? Because we have the original photogrammetry data, we've got obviously the application that was compiled. And they said, well, we have this amazing archive, and we're going to put it in this archive. And I said, wow, that is super cool. So let me tell you about this archive. It's called the Visual History Archive, and it is the largest archive of its kind. It basically has taken the testimony of survivors of various genocides. So it started with the European Holocaust, but then it went out to 9 different genocides now, because unfortunately these things keep happening. And takes testimony of basically like what survivors come forward and tell their story. The average testimony length is around 2 hours, so it's an incredibly methodical process of laying out each detail about what people went through. And so there's now 55,000 survivors that have come forward to give their testimony, and it is extraordinary. The amount of hours is over 115,000 hours, and they have, in addition to that, photographs and documents and whatnot that people have brought to also just kind of provide evidence of what they went through. What's especially cool about it is that, and you can kind of see it here, this is the online portal, is that in addition to the video testimony, they also have researchers that have gone through and provided metadata for every minute in which somebody's talking about something. So in this case, for example, segment 2, so minute 2, the person has described basically their family members, so including their mother and father, and some keywords around what they're describing. And this is really cool because 55,000 testimonies, now when you index out all the names, for example, that have been talked about, you have 1.3 million names that have been talked about. And then you have over 1,000 keywords of metadata of like just kind of what people went through. So this is like, it's basically one of the most extraordinary collections of testimony, and it's big, like really big for what they can handle. So it's about 6 petabytes worth of data. And when I went to meet them, I said, where do you have this information stored? They said, well, we're very proud to tell you that we have it in 3 locations. I said, only 3? This sounds really vulnerable, right? It's a sensitive information. It's something that, there's a lot of people with agendas that might want to do something about destroying those facilities. And so, I spoke to them, I said, listen, I feel really passionately about this. And then after going to the Decentralized Web Summit, I said, I actually feel so passionate that I think I really want to spend some time figuring out how we can take decentralized technologies and be able to do an incredible decentralized storage project to take this testimony and bring it to a bunch of folks for safekeeping. So the idea is kind of in 3, we have a vision for this kind of transformation of our whole signal flow. So one is to look at collection, to be able to now start to capture new testimony and doing that in various decentralized ways. Preservation, so taking the existing testimonies and the ones that are coming in. And then finally, a whole project of education as well. And so, I don't need to tell this audience all the advantages of why you would ever want to use decentralized technologies to do this, but to recite them quickly, we do think that if you're going to spread something out, cryptography is a very important part of this because you want to show, hey, even though it's distributed, it still has integrity. And the vision that we have is that at the point for new testimony, could we actually cryptographically sign the photons as they hit the sensors of the cameras and establish a chain of custody from there and then all the way to the point of distribution. And the good news is that absolutely can be done. I've been in discussion with handset makers, large ones, who are saying we're on board to help, which is awesome. So, encryption of that kind for capture. Encryption, obviously, if you're storing the technology, then the data, then that obviously you want to make sure it's intact. And then, all the great things that a decentralized system could do, like censorship resistant and tamper-proof, and always available, and most importantly, resilient. And this is the area that has been really interesting to see, is that although there are some very good protocols that you can start to use to push out the data, really what our dream is to actually create something that is reactive, so that as nodes, for instance, might be shut down or unavailable, that the system itself could orchestrate the data to always kind of deal with an attack in this way. And that's something that is new, and it's an effort that we think would rise all the ships in the decentralized storage landscape. So we're passionate to get that done. So the idea is kind of, can we create this immutable ledger of testimony, or an immutable network of entity? And this is, I think, where everything started to crystallize for me. There's a very good relationship between technology adoption and social progress. It turns out people like to use new technologies to make the world more unified, or to use a line from the show, to make the world a better place. But that's, I say that in jest, but it's actually really true. And so I can't think of a better way to say intuitively, and I can explain this to my mom, okay, why does decentralized storage matter? Well, I've got 100 gigs that are totally free on this device. And if I believe that genocide is a problem, and I believe that storing this type of data on my device might help make a more resilient record of that data, well then, this seems like a really good use case for decentralized storage. And it's one that's intuitive, where my belief in this might also spur my adoption of it. So I really feel this could help get the decentralized web movement on firm ground with users. So this is the stack and the platform that we've been thinking about. There is lots to do, and we're starting, I think, just to mention one thing that's really cool, we're starting a visualization project actually first, and that's happening now at Stanford, so I thought I'd just chat with everyone about it. This is something I'm really geeked out It's awesome. Where we are going to actually take a collaboration with a data sculptor, he calls himself, and take all this metadata and all this incredible amount of information and work with a series of engineers to find trends and various basically patterns within the data, and then be able to visualize those with this artist. And that's going to be part of what we hope to be a major event in September, where we're going to be able to then launch the rest of the application and the network and all that. We are just beginning this process, but feel free to reach out to me if you are interested in getting involved. I am unfortunately running out to something else that I had planned for tonight, but I really wanted to be here, so if you don't see me around, feel free to email me, or I'm sure Wendy can put anyone in touch. The goal is really to create some common projects that we can help everyone with. So this is very much open source and done with open arms. So, thank you. Oh yeah, sure, let's do it.
Questions?
The first thing that came to my mind in terms of applications would be like deep fakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So have you looked at that as a,
Sure. So it's so every file there's a SHA-1 that's taken of it. So we know we have a signature of it, and the idea is to take that cryptographic signature and be able to decentralize even the storage of that. So there's deepfakes is a huge issue. This is in a sense, think of it as like kind of establishing a ground truth that you could use, and then if you wanted to do some comparisons to, let's say, some other videos that claim to be authentic, then you could use this kind of immutable record as a way of starting that analysis. We're not necessarily focusing on exactly kind of forensic tools to prove a deepfake. Instead, we're thinking about just how to store like the perfect copy of the master.
When this project was getting going in the mid-90s, there's this whole sort of tug and pull about wanting it to be seen, but also not seen, not abused. And there was this sort of hyper control and privacy about it, and sort of really didn't go online. It was invested in, but it wasn't available.
Yeah.
Is that shifting? Is the idea that the things are publicly available, or at least viewable?
Yeah, so as Bruce was mentioning, this has been going on for 25 years, and I can't speak for what the thinking was at the time. What I can speak about is now. The archive itself currently has 3,000 testimonies that are available on YouTube. Like they've definitely opened up in that respect. And then the full archive is available for university researchers, and it's just basically offered in a way where there's some mechanism to pay for the streaming of it, because they were just not able to get storage of it. Costs like millions of dollars every year, so to get a performing system for storage was a challenge to make all of it publicly facing. But the spirit, from everything that I've been told, is very much to open it up. So yeah, push it out for storage and also push it out for
help
viewing.
with that.
Cool. All right. Awesome.
Yeah, you might have said this already, but what would be the best way for a layperson to help? And are you still collecting more testimonies?
Yeah, so testimonies, oh great, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Part of what we're going to be doing is definitely collecting new testimony, and it's so interesting, by the way, these guys are like experts at testimony, and they talked to me about a new project I'm really passionate about of intergenerational testimony capture. So it's sons and daughters going to their parents and doing the interview, which of course is very different from, let's say, a university researcher coming in. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we're just beginning to put the pieces together. So if you reach out, get in touch, I can keep you in the loop, and we'll start to kind of educate everyone about the roadmap. Very, very early days, like literally like this week, we're kicking off some of the initiatives. So
And gmail.com.
that's me. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
The question had been, what could a layperson do? What kind of technologists would be super helpful for you right now?
Protocol. So we're working on trying to, this orchestration layer about how to create the resilient distribution of these files is something that we are just now getting into. And as of this week, we found one developer who we think is going to be helpful. Part of the initiative also, by the way, is to not be beholden to one protocol. I've been very insistent on this, that we want the topology of storage to be as diverse as possible. So everything from a mobile phone to a web server. Yeah, developers that are keen on looking on that. And then also we have obviously consumer-facing, let's say mobile applications and platforms, web platforms. So anyone who has experience even in front-end design, things like that, all that would be very welcome. Oh, we've been
A little more lighthearted application maybe. Have you looked at other kind of experiential phenomena to apply this same kind of approach to? I don't know, rock concerts in the 60s, Woodstock, something like that. I realize it's not nearly as serious, but it could be a lot of fun.
Brewster has got all sorts of fun things that I just, I think if you spin up that photograph over there, you have the beginnings of the sound library and whatnot. Here's the incredible thing about the foundation is that, and what I'm hoping this initiative helps open people's minds to, I learned about this in the context of, this how it got started. Schindler's List, the European Holocaust, but they've expanded to 9 genocides and unfortunately having to do more. And so I'm really passionate about the responsibility that they take and specifically focusing just on genocide. Because you can imagine like civil rights issues would be also something that you want to document. But they're saying no, like, and again, not to be spoiled mood, but it's like very specific focus. It's stuff that's classified as genocidal acts under the Genocide Convention, systemic mass killing. These are things that we just have to remember what happened. Yeah, we're laser focused on the things that unfortunately that we have to do.
There's a question in the back?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering what kind of art that you're trying to make out of this. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I can't announce quite yet the partnership with a specific artist because it's being ironed out, but we are looking at, our canvas is going to be incredible if we can get this done. It's projection mapping is where we're going to begin. So taking this huge building and projecting this incredible visualization of the archive. And most importantly, I really think this is going to be helpful for everyone in the DWeb community to do a visualization of what a decentralized storage network actually looks like. So getting people to understand, like, actually what this is, we think that a piece of art could actually be very helpful. So think of it as a really cool, graphic, VFX kind of heavy node graph.
Thanks. I was trying to actually.
Yeah.
With this tour at museums?
So touring in museums, projecting on big buildings. We have a major symphony that's willing to do a collaboration with us on that, which is like, so art is very much kind of top of mind. And yeah, so visualizing like a decentralized network. Well, what does that actually look like? That I think is going to be maybe one of the things we can contribute to.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't say, when does the new season of Silicon Valley start?
We'll start writing in a month, and they have not announced the air date yet.
Okay.
So I don't know.
And will there be any decentralization in the storylines?
Every year.
on.
No, here's the thing. It's like every year the guys, and I'm, I've got 3 weeks until we start, but we sit there on the first day and everyone kind of looks at each other and we're like, what do we do?
No.
Honestly, that's really what happens. I think the guys are really passionate about this. We have Mike here, so I think there's a tremendous appreciation of what the importance of this is. And yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's there's a lot of great stories to tell, and many that we glean from just being part of this community. So yeah.
Will you come back in April when you're teaching and tell us about the history of the internet?
Oh yeah. So we're doing a really cool course to teach some MBAs that there may be some things aside from making money to do in creating their platforms, their online platforms. So so we're very much going kind of from Doug Engelbart forward.
Good.
Yeah, so really passionate to tell that story.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Jonathan. So cool. I'd like to bring up Jared and Celestial of Holochain and Holo. And sorry to do this for the people who came in late, but we all stood up and introduced ourselves. So if you came in a little bit late, could you tell us who you are and what brings you here? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Suri. So I work in like computing systems and infrastructure, and I'm interested in decentralized web and decentralized distributed technologies.
Perfect, perfect. If you're looking for a job, tell us that. If you're a student, tell us that. If you're interested in meeting a specific person, tell us. This is your chance to make your dreams come true. There's a couple of other folks who came.
Right back here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael. I work at Protocol Labs, like at for stuff. And the community team is actually in town this week for an offsite, so which is a community from Protocol Labs.
So does everyone know Protocol Labs, affiliated with IPFS?
Yeah, I'm Terry. I'm a community manager, and the main project I'm working on right now is called Proto School, which is kind of an educational community, so tutorials on IPFS and eventually other decentralized protocols and tools, and then kind of chapters, hopefully around the globe as we get more chapter leaders interested, where people could go and work through those tutorials with mentors. And, so if you're interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to talk.
Cool. Proto School.
My name is Portia. I am also part of Protocol Labs on the community team, and I work on how to get people actually building things with IPFS and learning about the building blocks of distributed web and making it something more than just a topic that we talk about, to actually like the building blocks of creating the apps of today and tomorrow.
Excellent. Well,
And can we get one
oh,
more?
yes, yes, yes.
Hi, I'm Amy Chen. I work in enterprise software, but I've been really interested in decentralized and distributed web and blockchain. So I'm just trying to learn as much as I can. Trying to do a little startup project on the side for social media news and history on a blockchain called historyledger.net. So come talk to me about that. Thanks.
Well, it's my.
Wendy, don't let this guy get away.
Thank you.
I'm Brian. I'm here because decentralized web breaks out some lots of ways. I'd like to fix that. So talk to people about how to fix it.
So you two are from Holochain and Holo, and I asked you to both come up here before your talk because I think it would just be helpful if you tell us just a little bit about Holochain and Holo. How many people are working for you now? And start with the Holo port that is one of the key things that you've been building. What's that?
The Holoport is basically a hosting box that is not necessary. You could use your own computer or an old laptop that you have to host data, but it's basically our way of making this mainstream and accessible for people like me who don't code and don't have an old computer to use to host data.
And Holo versus Holochain, can you explain?
Yeah, Holochain, it's easiest, the way we're trying to frame it now is Holochain is a framework and Holo is a platform. That's a very simple way of explaining it. But basically Holo is the company, and Holochain is the open source software that we're giving away to the world. But in order to do that, we have to pay people and take care of people and build an entire organization to do that like at scale. And so that's basically what Holo is about.
And another way to think about that is if Holochain is what you're building apps on, Holo is the ecosystem in which we all can host those apps.
And you're funded by an ICO, you issued a coin. Tell us a little bit about that.
Tell that story.
Well, we actually started as a crowdfunding campaign with the Holoports and on Indiegogo, and we sold about 2,000 Holoports, raised about $1 million, and then had an ICO following it. It was kind of it's like they were joined together as kind of a storyline, and then the ICO raised money following that, and that was for both Holo and Holochain.
So,
but officially it's Holo. It was a token sold through the Ethereum network, ERC20 token, and then as we transition to Holo Fuel, which is a different currency, a mutual credit currency that will run in the Holo ecosystem, we'll basically take one-to-one all of those Ethereum tokens, hopefully slowly out of circulation or quickly. We'll see how it works.
and you describe yourselves as kind of a startup. You started kind of as core volunteers almost, and now you've hired.
Yeah, I think now we're at like 55 or 60 people, and August of 2017 there were 15 of us all living in a house together for the like inaugural internship, not getting paid and wearing 25 hats to make this thing get off the ground. So we're really happy now to be able to hire talent to do jobs that I don't have to do anymore.
Excellent. So you could use the Holocoin to pay people to work for Holo using Holochain, and you could plug in the Holo port. And none of this is a blockchain.
That's right.
Okay, that's the context.
Household?
Jared,
A little
take
bit.
it away. Thank you.
Let's see if I can hook this up quickly. Yay. I can feel myself getting warmer. So, this is actually not my normal routine. I'm usually neither public facing nor focused on Holochain tech. I focus on a lot of the people, internal operations and growth and onwards over the last like year and a half or 4 years, depending on how you frame it. I've volunteered for quite a while. This is kind of like a test in some ways, so you're kind of a bit of a guinea pig for us. A test in that I'm doing this for the first time, and also a test in that we're hoping that many more people will do this same or a similar presentation for the first time to kind of spread this word and pull people into building basically applications on Holochain. So this slide deck is pretty quick. That's the idea. And the idea is to be able to pull people through this storyline. And we've been working on this story for a long time. It's one of the hardest challenges we have. As you heard Wendy point at, like both the Holo and the Holochain and the Holo ports and all this Holo stuff, it's kind of tricky, right? Like it has like this vocabulary challenge. And so part of what we're trying to do is do a much better job on that storytelling side to all sorts of different audiences. So this particular deck is more technically focused, but also hopefully not so technical that it couldn't be followed by someone that's somewhere on that spectrum. So that's kind of the run-up. Basically, I have one big fear tonight that it's not that I look stupid, it's more that my stupidity makes the understanding of Holochain not as good as it could be. So that was my little opening concern. So feel free to lob things at me. But if you have any challenges or questions that you want to answer, we have a massive amount of content online trying to go through every step of this, both highly technical as well as much less so. Videos, code bases, etc. So just keep that in mind. And the reality is this is a 10-year project with all of that is available. So what the heck is Holochain? Holochain is a new way of running truly peer-to-peer applications. That's the basic way of explaining it. So these applications, they're run entirely on the devices of the users themselves, rather than on a server that you don't have control over or that you don't own. Holochain applications means essentially that there's no web servers, there's no mining, and there's no cryptocurrency necessary, at least. Holo does have a cryptocurrency built on it. That's part of how we're doing our funding mechanism. That's also part of the way that we're trying to create an ecosystem where people can exchange value within this larger framework. But the upshot is you don't need crypto to run a Holochain app. You can run a Holochain app totally separate from us. You could literally just be 3 people creating an app that you can run in your own environment. All you need is the devices that the users put up in order to host that information. So essentially, you're offsetting your own use by having your phone or your computer store, validate, and serve that content to other users that are also part of that app. So in other words, it's a pattern, not a platform. Kind of speaking to the words we were using before. Whereas Holo is a platform, but Holochain is more of a pattern, is a better way to frame it. So there's no one big Holochain, unlike in blockchain, and there's actually many Holochains. So if you have an application, you actually have many Holochains working together. And I'll go into a bit more detail there. So each app, you can actually think of it as its own social space that's completely separate from other social spaces or very interconnected with other social spaces, depending on what the app architecture determines or says it's built for, essentially. And it's a separate social space where everyone essentially plays by the same rules. That's kind of the definition of a single app within Holochain. So there's a little note here. I kind of spoke to this before, but if you want to build an app that's similar to Slack, you could run it just using your phones. You really don't have to involve us on Holochain or anyone else in the world. And that's what we mean by creating this pattern rather than a platform. So you can literally take this pattern and use it somewhere else. It's like going to the fabric store, pulling a pattern for a shirt off, and then you can use that pattern in the same exact way that it was delivered, or maybe you add sleeves, or maybe you add like a crazy collar or something completely different, but it's up to you to use that pattern how it works best for you and all the people in your social space. So there's this challenge of, when you mentioned blockchain, that we're not a blockchain, and there's this challenge where a lot of the people that are in the space are very familiar with blockchains, and in some ways that actually makes it more difficult to explain Holochain to folks because they have this prior understanding of how blockchains work, and like we have the tagline, think outside the blocks, in the sense that because you're connected to that definition of what a blockchain is, it's really difficult for many people to kind of like pull themselves away into like a totally different paradigm and actually imagine what that world might look like. Because most of the imagination and storytelling has been around blockchain rather than alternatives to it. So we're solving for a very different problem. Blockchain's goals, arguably at least, or one of the goals of some blockchains was digital anonymous cash, as Satoshi and Bitcoin point to. We have a very different goal. We're kind of working on exactly if this is the perfect goal to frame in this slide, but this is the current best way to express it, to foster more effective, adaptable, and vibrant communities so that people can take this pattern and use it in any number of ways, but also interoperate with other apps that are doing other interesting things very easily. So another way to frame it, blockchain is focused on transcending relationships, whereas Holochain is focused on fostering relationships. So again, a different goal requires a different architecture. So to create a peer-to-peer application framework, we basically combine the tech from 3 established projects that might be familiar to many of you. One, we use tamper-resistant logs, similar to blockchain. We use efficient shared storage, similar to BitTorrent. And we also use agent-centric identity, very similar to Git. So how a Holochain app works. First thing is, obviously, a user has to install it in order to use it. But there's basically 4 primary parts to any Holochain app. 1, identical rules, as I mentioned before. The app itself, everyone who uses or engages with that app is using the exact same set of rules, identical. 2, cryptographic keys. 3, a local source chain. And 4, shared storage. So let's dive in just a little bit deeper into that. So identical rules, basically, as mentioned, every user plays by the exact same rules. So they could be made by that builder or the users or a combination of both that's determined in the architecture from the get-go. And if you essentially change the rules, you're essentially forking and creating a new app. So cryptographic keys. Every action you take is cryptographically signed by your device. No, that's not working. So there's not a global ordering of all users' actions, which is obviously in contrast to blockchain. So every action a user takes is recorded and locked in the order it was taken on that user's, essentially, holochain. Other users then back up those actions in that app's shared storage. So you're in this social space using the same app, you take an action, it's cryptographically signed, and then shared and stored just in a distributed fashion. So a little more about shared storage. We're using a similar approach to how BitTorrent works, as mentioned. BitTorrent, for those of you who don't know, is peer-to-peer file storage. And Holochain adds to that by adding an enforcement of shared agreements by the peers themselves. So it's actually the peers that are doing the enforcing.
I'm a little unclear about
Sure.
what you mean by rules and agreements.
Okay.
It's kind of abstract.
Okay.
Maybe you can give an example of application, like what can we do?
What kind of rules exist?
I mean, I would say
That-
application is, my understanding as someone who went to a Holochain hackathon a couple of years ago, is that application is a set of rules. So like Twitter is a set of rules. You say, you post a thing up and then everyone sees this thing. That's a set of rules. Obviously, they want to be like a lot more granular, so everyone agrees on how this thing should work. But you can think of an application that people participate in as a set of rules. Is that correct?
Yeah, that seems fair. Does that help? Somewhat?
Like the rules
Okay.
for Twitter are, you are a user of Twitter, you send a Twitter thing to this thing, and then now everyone sees the Twitter thing. And then you could maybe add other rules like Twitter did, where if you like at someone, then it sends like a notification to that person and stuff like that.
And you have these terms and conditions that you're supposed to follow as a Twitter user. Twitter doesn't always enforce those, but technically you are under that agreement, right? So you've agreed to play by their rules. So it's
Okay.
similar in this space, where if you were using an app, you would be you're agreeing essentially to play by those rules. And so what ends up happening, the way the Holochain is constructed, is that those rules are validated by the people that you interact with. Can I finish and then we come back to questions? Go ahead.
Do you have a consensus mechanism that encodes the enforcement of shared agreements?
No, there's no consensus in Holochain.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll definitely take more questions. So, as I just kind of mentioned, each action is validated by the devices responsible for it. So essentially, the devices that are responsible for it are the ones doing the validation. I just kind of did a circular description there. Basically, each validating node checks their own copy of the shared rules for violations, and then they accept or reject based on those. So if the action doesn't break any app rules, those devices sign it as being valid, store it, and then start serving it to others. So it's kind of like the check, yes, this is valid, we can store it, I agree to store it, and it's okay. And then when it gets pulled by others, it's seen as valid by those other nodes. So just once more, 4 foundations: identical rules, cryptographic keys, local source chain, and shared storage. This is a common thing that you're probably all aware of. It's very, very intensive to operate on blockchains. So it kind of raises an obvious question, like how do you do Holochain then if blockchain is that energy intensive? So again, as we've kind of said in 2 different ways, remember Holochain is very different from blockchain. So it doesn't follow that Holochain will be very energy intensive as well. It's actually the exact opposite. And so this, I'm going to kind of explain through a story why that is. So imagine you have an app that's a peer-to-peer Twitter app. Old style Twitter, there's 140 characters, so quite short, but it's really, really popular. Like the whole world uses it popularly, right? 7.7 billion participants, every person on Earth. Not, technically possible, but very, very unlikely. Nonetheless, it's a huge, huge app with a ton of users. So the average tweet currently is about 1.1 per Twitter user. So if this app had about that same rate of actions, and you decided, within those app rules to make 100 backups each time that action was taken, you just kind of do the math and pull that all the way out. So one tweet is that many bytes, and then you get essentially 22 million bytes per year. So it's actually not that much. 24 megabit photo, a little less than that. So 1 year of your use of your phone is 1 year of use, and your phone is responsible for the same data as basically one photo. So it's quite small. So if you can use an app that works in the way that you want, doesn't stalk you, doesn't spy on you, you aren't forced to watch ads, basically is the perfect app, then would you be willing to use it for just that one photo burden? You think your phone could handle that? Most of our phones, I'm sure, could. Blockchain, on the other hand, for a year of use, every full node is responsible for essentially 75 million photos. So could your phone handle that? Could your computer? Probably not. It's probably running at industrial scale, something quite large, like so one caveat, obviously, tweets are tiny. Peer-to-peer YouTube would require a different amount of storage, way more. But imagine having to store that in a blockchain. It's incomprehensible that you could do that. So efficiency is great, but we think the most interesting thing about Holochain is the new capacities it enables in all sorts of different arenas of kind of human interaction. And that's really why we're here. So this is one story that we're playing with, like, to try to make that a bit more visceral for people. So using Holochain apps, you can actually remix multiple Holochain apps. And so the thinking here is that, if you have Susan, she has 5 different ride-sharing apps that are built on Holochain. One's kind of like Uber, one's kind of like Lyft, maybe one's like Zimrides, if you remember Zimrides. Maybe there's a couple co-ops that operate locally and are just motorcycles. If she wanted to look up from all 5 of those apps, she could do it, and she could actually create her own interface so that she could call up a ride and then decide which one to use with one button, and then basically cancel all of the other ones that she had reached out to. And she could do that and build that own interface, even if she was the only person in the world that wanted that exact interface. So that's the kind of flexibility and power that we see this sort of framework enabling all sorts of different scenarios and possibilities.
She could do that?
She could do that.
She has what kind of ability to it?
Like, not currently, but eventually, not many. So not a very technical person, but a person that can essentially choose what sort of interface they want based on what sort of grouping of apps. So that's the vision. So today that internet puts applications at the center, as we like to frame. So it's kind of like, many of us are drawn to our phone many times. Like, there's many times in the day when I feel like I'm conflicting with my phone. And part of the reason we think that is because you have to go someplace and then come back. So you have to go to Facebook and then come back, and you have to go to Airbnb and then you have to come back, and you have to go to your messages and then come back. And that's essentially, we think, in part because applications are at the center of all of our digital lives, or much of our digital lives. And we're essentially trying to flip that on its head and put humans at the center of the internet. So these are some use cases. P2P social media, we actually have a group called Junto that just started a crowdfunding campaign that's trying to do P2P social media. We're talking to a few organizations about disaster relief coordination, and maybe a different sort of organization with some somewhat similar use cases. Supply chain coordination, of course, and P2P currency systems are some of the use cases that we see. So just to come back to Holo, because there is this disambiguation that we constantly have to deal with. Holo is P2P web hosting, as a P2P web hosting marketplace. So the real idea here is to bridge to mainstream users, so that this isn't just in the land of CryptoKitties and Ethereum, Ethereum-focused folks, but like also grandmas is essentially the goal. So that solves 2 problems for us. removes that barrier for so many more people. So that means that app developers have a way larger market than they would if it was just at the kind of, not the entry level, but the, what's Jeffrey Moore's term, I'm forgetting. Basically the early adopters, right? Otherwise you're only seeking early adopters, and it doesn't seem like, then you have to cross that chasm. And so the idea is that we can jump that much more quickly with Holo, and also to subsidize Holochain. So the reality is that Holo is the company that supports this vision, but the vision that we're really trying to see come into the world is Holochain. That's kind of the big enchilada. And we believe that open source framework can change and basically changes a lot of the current paradigms that we operate in as humans trying to communicate and solve problems, and go about living in this kind of increasingly crazy world. Yeah, we would love all of your help, essentially. Yes?
Sure. As an audience member, what's the one action I can do to help out Holochain right now?
Probably just educate yourself enough to be able to explain it to one other person.
Do you have any apps that are on Holo yet that we can explore?
Currently building them. You can begin to play with some if you're a developer, but we're like right on the edge. We're basically just about to launch an internal testnet of Holo, which is essentially the first robust app that will be built on Holochain. Maybe not the first, but one of.
And then I have one more question. How do you encourage users to use their device as storage in this decentralized network?
That's basically what Holo is about, and in part we're using the Holo ports to help do that by creating like this basically off-the-shelf computer that they'll be able to plug in. They'll be able to pull updates for, and then be connected in that network in a pretty straightforward like plug-and-play way.
Are they being paid to do that, to run the computer?
They'll be paid in Holo Fuel, which is the currency we'll transition to once we're in a full open network.
Question about, I guess kind of piggybacking on that about the Holo Fuel. I
Yeah.
guess since it's not a blockchain, how does the cryptocurrency play in use and reward, or what are you earning it for, or how do you earn it, and how do you then spend it, I guess, by using that or building it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so we did fundraising actually with an ERC20 token, and that's called HOT, Holo token. And what we're doing is building this ecosystem where HOT will be traded one-to-one for Holo Fuel, which is a totally different currency with a different accounting mechanism. It's called mutual credit accounting. And so it's a very different form of currency than pretty much any other cryptocurrency. But it doesn't exist yet. It will exist once the network launches and is fully open. And there's basically like a whole series of mechanisms around how that currency will function, but there will be a reserve where different types of currency will be able to transition through, some cryptocurrencies, but also fiat currencies. And the easiest way to learn more about that would be probably to read what we call our green paper, which was written about a year ago, and it's all about Holo as well as that currency system. So.
But just, I guess, to go back to your Lyft Uber example.
Yeah.
Is that the builder of that, every time they use it, they have to spend Holo? Is that, or have Holo to actually use their app?
Yeah, they would basically, probably at least initially, unless they, invested in the ICO or they were a heavy host, they would, pay hosts in the network to host their application.
And that's just automatic, or I have to find 10 rides because it's raining outside and like people will be canceling or something. Is it not?
No, I mean it would be incorporated in the entire ecosystem. So in some ways, like it would be your balance sheet essentially that's happening in the background. So if you purchase something, you'd be purchasing it in Holo Fuel within that ecosystem, and then if you also got paid because you went back home and you had a Holo port sitting on your desk. That balance, like essentially the way mutual credit currency works is that everything is always equal to 0. So if you're +1, then someone else is -1. And the thinking, there's like a whole philosophical thing about what mutual credit currency is, but the biggest thing in a nutshell from my perspective is that it ends up being able to breathe and move based on supply and demand in a different way than most of our current currencies do.
So I would be paying Uber in Holo?
Well, you wouldn't be paying Uber unless Uber decided to build an Uber on Holochain. So it's only going to be apps that are built on Holochain.
Yes, I was just going to ask something about that too, like for apps built on Holochain. I'm still in the process of learning myself.
For
so
sure.
Just a whole bunch of questions on, well, like who is your customer? Is it the individual or organizations like Lyft, Uber, versus like, well, who owns the data and where does it live? Versus like Lyft and Uber would have to make it public for people to be able to build, like you were saying, connect them together
Right.
for how they want. And then there's a difference, and I'm learning some difference between decentralized web versus distributed. So then
Right.
say I have a picture I want to share, or I don't know what you meant by the copies, and what if I leave my phone, what if it disappears? Can we trust that? Like where does the data live? Where do we trust that it exists?
Whole lot of questions there.
Yeah.
Losing your passwords, we're building an app called DeepKey, which is essentially working towards solving that problem or making it much less of a problem. Your data, you would be able to port your data. Is there another question that's?
I think she was wondering about permissions, and I'm wondering about that too.
I'm not the best person to explain that, basically. But there's a bunch of like information online about permissions specifically.
Do you have an do you have an estimation how much it's going to cost to host a website?
Not yet, no.
Is it going to be cheaper than hosting
I mean,
is?
yeah, that's the idea, is that it would be much cheaper.
Sure. Give some kind of summary of how like Holochain works. Like it seems incompatible to have no consensus and also have a currency.
Totally. There's not, I don't have a great summary on hand, and really reading the green paper and getting kind of deeper into the larger story of how that currency functions and why it's different than other ones would serve you better than me doing probably a poor job of trying to explain it right now. Yeah.
If I could venture a guess based on what little I know about the general thing.
Yeah.
By the way, this is not at all supported by Holochain because I went to a hackathon like 2 years ago, so I do not speak for this organization. But because each application is like a subset of nodes, I would guess that there is something like a Holo organization which also runs on Holochain, and you would probably want to be a part of it because then you can get the network effects of working in this ecosystem. So it's probably an application that runs on Holochain, and its rules have some sort of mechanism, I don't know if you want to call it consensus or whatever, but there are a bunch of rules where you say like, okay, I'm going to sign this with my private key, and then you're going to be able to verify who I am, and I'm going to do some work, and you're going to check out with a bunch of other people who say, yes, that is the work you promised to do, and then your ledger gets updated. But I'm guessing that Holo itself is running this in Holochain. It just happens to be an
Right.
organization you can be part of.
Exactly. It's basically just an app built on Holochain, but it'll be a large app.
Say, you know, I'm a UC Berkeley student. I want to basically have a UC Berkeley peer-to-peer network. Can I fork Holochain and kind of disconnect from this global thing? I'm trying to figure out how the topologies work or are possible, or if my question makes sense to you.
No, I mean, it's all open source.
It's
so-
all open source?
Yeah.
So that could be done.
Go ahead, Steve.
One more question.
Thanks for bearing with me.
I think Jared did a great job.
Hey.
So, does anyone want to give a lightning talk besides Barack, who I know? All right. Then,
Yeah.
okay,
Lightning by, what, 2 minutes or something?
3 minutes total. All right, Barack, let's do 2 lightning talks, and then we're going to end up with a bang with Peter. So, are you ready? Are you You want to come up and, okay, and I'm gonna actually time you, if you don't mind.
There's no internet access.
There is internet access.
I'm just trying to bring a page as a slide. Oh, well, forget it. I'll try to describe it. It's okay.
You can see if you could do
I
that.
feel my time is burning.
All right, all right, all right.
So this is a project, kind of a grand open project to connect the half the world's population around connected to the internet. 3.5+ billion people are not connected. The current technologies and business models are failing. They're right at the edge of kind of return on investment. Instead of investing further out, they're investing back in small cell, millimeter wave, high capacity services to the more well-to-do. So the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, this is all about, you know, a whole bunch of things. One of them is connecting everybody. And so there's a consortium called the Partnership for Public Access that's trying to address all those difficult circumstances. P for PA.net. And so this is a consortium of international organizations, including IEEE, the Internet Society, the International Federation of Library Associations, kind of the national library associations that represent the roughly 2 million libraries in the world, school, public, academic. And so there are kind of three approaches. One is public access centers, a hub and a community where people can go get help, training, and access. A library, for example, not necessarily. The second one is community networks. This is self-built networks by people in places that are not being served, being able to use relatively simple tools to build these out. And so you have a build out and a build in phenomenon. The build out phenomenon is kind of the government obligation to deliver government services, digital services somehow to everybody. And that's what libraries tend to do. And delivering connectivity to that endpoint is kind of a basic thing under universal service, like E-rate, which may even subsidize part of the Internet Archives connection. And so that's the build out part. It's kind of an endpoint for a government obligation to connect people. The other part's the build in. That's the self-reliant communities building their own networks to connect in. The other circumstance where people are just, the third one, where people are too far away, they are starting to just build ad hoc IP networks, just running their own, you know, Wikipedia on a thumb drive, those kinds of applications that can support education for one thing. A lot of content, most content is the same content everybody wants, so a lot of it can be offloaded. It also be localized, but it's also kind of the circumstance that's the hardest to do. And so one case would be in the mountains of northern Colombia, where the FARC, the rebels, have been fighting for 50 years. There's no investment out there, so Libraries Without Borders, a French group, is set up like 20 libraries out of these locations, and they update by donkey or something like that. So those three approaches can theoretically address any circumstance, anywhere, for anybody. And so check it out, and you know, let us know what you think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Tell you, while you're getting set up to do yours, I'm going to bring up Peter, and we're going to talk just a little bit about Ink and Switch Labs. In fact, do you want to bring your other staffer up?
That's not a staffer.
Okay, so while Barack is getting set up, okay, this is Peter Van Hardenberg, and this is Matt.
Matt Tugnetti.
And they're with Ink and Switch Labs, which is what?
So we're a private industrial research lab.
Kind of like Bell Labs or Zero.
Yeah, on a shoestring budget without a corporate affiliation. We're like the seed round startup equivalent of Bell Labs, without the ICO, as is the market style. So we run a few different research tracks. We've been really interested. The sort of impetus behind the lab is that we feel like collectively computers have been going to a bad place. It's advertising based, you're the product. Other people own your data. All of our computing technology is focused around the attention economy now. So like I've got apps on your phone. If I turn my phone into airplane mode, this becomes a really shiny brick. And that's mostly because I also stopped getting push notifications. My software is not mine. It's some global corporation with billions of people on it who are all there to harass me at every moment. And for those of us who think that maybe our computers could be a bicycle for the mind, that's kind of unfortunate. You know, we've given up a lot. Now we've got a lot too. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on Google News and Twitter and everything else. I'm not here to moralize. It's that I also have a job. And I have had other jobs before I worked at the lab. And it's increasingly hard to find tools that let you think and concentrate for a long time to do the kind of work it takes to be creative. And so that's the overall umbrella for our lab. And decentralization is a means to an end for us to bring the locus of control back to me, user, or you, the user who's making things yourself. So that's our interest in this.
Cool. Well, that is the context of what Peter's going to share with you. A couple of months ago, no, it's June. June we did a meetup, and Peter and Matt brought this super cool decentralized thing called Pixel Pusher, where you could be, it was kind of like a Google Docs for art making. You would be drawing, I would be drawing, and then it would sync up our drawings and have to decide, you know, I made it blue, but you made it red, who had primacy. But you could do decentralized offline drawing that came together.
You know, I like to call it Google Docs without the Google.
Google Docs without the Google, absolutely.
And it's very interesting hearing what Holochain is doing. You know, we're all chasing, I think, Ted Nelson's coattails here. And he's been talking about this sort of Xanadu system since the 1960s, which is everyone has access to all the information. And, you know, we're all trying to, I think, pick away at that in our own way.
Well, we're going to bring you back in about 3 minutes, actually. So Barack is the founder of something called Ether, and it's AETHER, if you want to look it up. And he's got, yeah, there it is, Ether. I'm going to let him tell you what that is. Very quickly. Okay.
So apologies for the accent. So this is going to be short. This is basically what I have. It's something that I have been using, and it's effectively a P2P network of communities. You can think of it as subreddits, basically. It's what it is. It's kind of a Reddit platform. It allows people to create their own communities out of this. And instead of going to this presentation, I'm just going to show you guys the application, so that might actually make more sense. So this is effectively it. And what I have is, by the way, you can download it. It's available on Windows, Mac, even Linux. It actually does work. So I basically have all of the subscriptions that I like on my site. I can actually subscribe to, you know, new things. And the top communities are, I think, there's a couple thousand users at this point. And I subscribe to that. I can subscribe to that. If I want to look for something, I can actually search, get all of the, you know, nice communities. And if you go to any of these, you will just get the classic, pretty classic discussion, as you can expect. There's a lot of people commenting on these things. That is basically it.
Oh, thank you. So Ether, the decentralized Reddit. Okay, Peter. Peter's going to be showing us something that he's been working on at his lab called Farm. And I'll let him describe that. But once again, he works for Ink and Switch Lab, which is kind of a think tank, really, to try and create tools that don't abuse us, but tools that we deserve. So,
Oh, Wendy, you tell our story so beautifully. Thank you.
Peter Van Hardenberg.
Okay, let's have a little look-see here. There should be a present button somewhere. Corporate tool of control. There it is. All right, cool. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about Farm. I want to talk a little bit about the motivation behind things. I talked a little bit about this before. It's actually wonderful to follow the Holochain presentation and hear Brewster talk about these wonderful things. Something has gone wrong, and I almost don't need to ask this, we've already talked about it. Who owns your computer today? Does Google own it? Does Apple own it? You can't publish your own software to your own iPhone without paying a tax. We've been building these research experiments at the lab. We built one for iOS recently, and we were discussing whether Apple would permit us to deploy our software to other people. That is stupid. It's like fundamental. We can't deploy software to our own machines. But we're not here to talk about Apple tonight. We're here to talk about farm. And I want to take you back to the early internet. The early internet was made out of text files. HTML, for those of you familiar with it, is the hypertext markup language. The Internet Archive's own Ted Nelson coined this notion of hypertext, that text could be nonlinear. And then some nerd at CERN kind of messed it all up by implementing a tiny piece of it, and it took off before Ted was ready. But the really cool thing about the internet of the early 90s was that it was participatory. Anyone could make one of these text files, and anyone could put it up on the internet. It was very decentralized. Federated might be a good word for it, because you still had to have servers. Today, we've kind of lost something. Today, we've still got this HTML and CSS thing. I spend a lot of time complaining about the vagaries of like float left, clear none. Actually, writing apps is pretty hellacious. There's this like complete alphabet soup of technologies, databases. Do I need a blockchain or like a Bitcoin or a Mongo or a Postgres? Am I running it in AWS? Yeah, I'm going to run it in AWS. And so now I have to pay an AWS tax just to put a website up. What happened to this world where it was just a bunch of text files, right? The idea of making a website that's just a bunch of text files that we stick on a server somewhere, it's like retro. It has a kind of like steampunk aesthetic to it. Right? This is a beautiful act of rebellion to not have server-side code. But today, if you want to do anything interesting with HTML, the actual HTML that we serve is sort of like a dead butterfly under glass. It's not the app, it is the spoor of the app. The app lives in the cloud somewhere, which is, as we all know, somebody else's computer, but the content that you get in your computer is just its casting off. I don't think that's great for a number of reasons. We've talked a lot about decentralization for kind of philosophical notions of freedom and self-determination. I think that's great. I'm proud to be part of a community that cares about that. But there's some like real brass tacks problems here. These are all pieces of software that were important parts of my life that have gone away. George Martin is writing A Song of Fire and Ice, the Game of Thrones books, not quickly enough, but the problem is not that he's using WordStar 4.0 on an old DOS computer. That tool's still here, 25 years later. I have no trust that Google will not change the way Google Docs works and change my own workflows. I think that's a problem. These other apps had their own incredible journeys. Rdio was an incredible journey to make a better media player. Sunrise was a great new calendar that Microsoft bought. I'm told it's very nice inside Microsoft now, but I can't have it. I just got a notification on the way over here that Inbox is going away. That's my email client. My email client. That's as much a part of me as my hands. And now it's going, so there. Of course, apps that live in the cloud go down. This is the scariest Halloween costume I've ever seen. It's US Miss One. You'll notice if you look closely here that the status is green across the board, of course. And our software just stops working when we go into tunnels. Or it stops working if we stand on the front steps because the Wi-Fi can't get to the doorway. Our software stops working in so many places and in so many ways. It stops working over time, it stops working over space, and it doesn't have to. We worry so much about social media, but I am a social creature, but I want personal software. I want my software for me to be mine. I want it to hold my data. So we started enumerating the problems here. Things go offline, someone else can take your software away, whether they go bankrupt or get acquired, or just get bored and give up, or change it in a way you don't like. You have to trust them not to read your email. I think I trust Google. I think. So anyway, we started working on this. We're a research lab, and so we've essentially been building provocations instead of businesses. This is one of our first ones. I spoke about it here in this room about 8 months ago or so. It's Pixel Pusher. We built this sort of peer-to-peer data distribution system, and we wanted to sort of field test version control in a decentralized way. Git is not really decentralized anymore. Git has re-centralized in GitHub, now Microsoft property. And so we started to say, well, what if we had this sort of peer-to-peer data distribution layer? How would that look to use? What does it mean to fork an image? So we built this Pixel Pusher implementation here. If I can gesture a little bit, you can see someone's drawn a banana. And then someone else has added, I don't know, a little kitchen behind it and made it into a chili pepper. That one's an eggplant. And then you can see over here, we've got kind of a zoomed in version. We have this original eyeball. Somebody's made a Mr. Potato Head. Someone's made a Groucho Marx mask. And because all of this is happening, and you can think of it perhaps as Git for data, we're able to merge all of that back down to the original document, either speculatively or permanently. Right? So we have this system that we've been working on called Hypermerge. It's based on technology from that, and something called the CRDT, which is a distributed data structure, Git for data. And so that was fun, and that worked. And it was pretty cool. We came and showed it a few places. People had a laugh. So our next iteration, we wanted to kind of push a little farther. Pixel Pusher was neat, but you may have noticed that pixel art is pretty grainy. And we had some performance problems even making sort of 32 by 32 pixels. You start to make it wide, it would bog down. So we went back and did another pass and wanted to push the boundaries a bit. So this is Pushpin, which was our sort of original canvas for ideas. Pushpin was really cool. Sort of solved the problem a lot of us have and sort of fit with the lab perspective, which is, if you're developing ideas, you're planning a trip, or you're thinking about a research project, or you're working on something new, you have this kind of disorganized collection of Post-it notes and screenshots and web clippings and that kind of thing. So we built this tool where you could sort of pile all that stuff in. But I often have collaborators in my projects, and so because we built on top of this sort of real-time streaming collaboration engine, we were able to share any of these sites with a link. And that was great. You could drop an image in and it would pop up on the other person's screen. No server infrastructure, no downtime. All the data's in your computer. If you turn off your Wi-Fi connection, everything keeps working. What happens is your work accumulates locally. Every change you make just works like a small Git commit. But instead of operating on streams of bytes in a linear text file, there are little operation commands that tell the data structure how to update and what you could see when you did that. So that was cool. And that got us thinking though, which is Pushpin was fun, but we all got the lab together in Berlin and everybody added something. Somebody made a drum machine, which was really fun. They sort of drew a grid of beats and you could hit play and it would play terrible web MIDI from everybody's computer in the Airbnb. Somebody built like a PDF viewer, which was really nice. When we're collecting research at the lab, we have all these dusty old PhDs we send around. So it was nice to have a repository where I could sort of put out a canvas of the prior art that we found. So that was neat, but now I had this uncomfortable feeling that although I built this wonderful decentralized data engine, once I wanted to extend it, I had to go back to Git. So we started talking and we thought, maybe it would be cool if we could have all these nice properties. You hold the data, you have the whole program. There's no daemons, there's no servers. You install it and it's yours. It keeps the data locally. You can share it with other people and they have it. And if they have the data, that becomes theirs. And so you can work offline, you can work online, you can collaborate live or independently. So if we can do all that with data, why can't we do it with code? Well, of course we can. And that's Farm. So Farm is our latest research project. The idea behind Farm is that you should be able to grow software together with other people. This is what Farm looks like. It looks a little bit like Pushpin. You've got a canvas again of ideas, but what's new is this other part here. We built a Visual Studio Code plugin. So the idea behind the VS Code plugin is that it speaks the same peer-to-peer data protocol, and so it can open up, inspect, and edit any part of the system, make changes, and then send them back. And if the demo gods are on my side, you'll see this really happen. So Farm, out of the box, is a workshop. It's a place like Pushpin where you can keep your ideas. You can take notes, you can share them with people, you can drop in images. But that alone is still just sort of a dead thing. We wanted to make it not just a workshop, but also a garden where things can grow. And so Farm is also a place where you can take the existing set of tools we give you and extend them. You can add your own new tools. You can make Farm into an app to organize your charades night with your kids, as our designer did. You can add a recipe box, which I'm collaborating on with my mom. You could make Farm into a slide presenter. Obviously I haven't, or I wouldn't be presenting on the Google Sheets. You know, and the idea is that with Farm, your software is yours, and if you don't like the way somebody else is expressing their intent in software, you can simply open it up, tweak a little bit under the hood, and pop the hood back down, and you're off to the races. You don't like that Twitter turned your star into a heart? Well, change it back, it's yours. So let's see if we can do this. Okay, I'm sure that this is going to be unhappy because I open and close the lid of my laptop. Just a quick reload of everything as a sort of a genuflection to the demo gods. So here we have some little programming experiments I've been working on. Ooh, it even loaded, lovely. So who's heard of the oblique strategies? Yes, it's a classic Brian Eno crisis intervention tool. If you're writing music or software or any other creative endeavor and you get stuck, the oblique strategies are designed to unstick you with a cryptic but hopefully useful piece of advice. So we can draw from this deck a few times until we find at least helpful advice. Sometimes it takes a while. So that's cool. But let's actually look at how that works for a minute. So if I click up here, I can actually edit this. Ooh, won't this be exciting if it works? Oh, it's trying to send it to the wrong window. Nope, nope, stop. Oh, already got it open. Ooh, let's see if this works. So what we have here is a two-part system. On the left, you can see the code. And because we're a crazy research lab with no desire to attain market share or users, the code is in a programming language called Elm. We could return to that very easily. But because we're a crazy research lab who like to imagine humans using our tools someday, the data is all available in something that looks a lot like JSON, and that's on the other side. So if I edit this data file from anywhere in the world, anyone who has this window open, they will receive my change, and in our current implementation, apply it blindly and automatically. And then they might have new advice, or less advice, or worse advice. Really, it's up to us to decide what constitutes good advice, I think. But similarly, I can also edit the code. So let's see if that works. Wouldn't that be fun? This is exciting. Pick one. Okay, well, let's see if we can change that message. This is like a real McCoy here. So, a very brief aside on Elm. Elm is a functional reactive programming language. It's strongly typed, and it looks a little bit like React, if you're familiar with that. The way our system works is that you have a document, which you can see. Whenever the document changes, it calls view. And then whenever you interact with the system and make changes, it calls update, which might trigger view again. So you get this little loop around and around. So we're going to change the view function. So right now it says what? Pick one. Let's just change it to say pick any. So what happens when I save this? Oh, it's complaining about a compile error. Ooh, that's exciting. What's the issue here? It's very hard to see on the small screen. Oh, well, maybe the demo gods have not blessed me today. I didn't refresh enough times. No, all right. Well, I'm not going to.
The debugging gods might still be with us.
The debugging gods may. When in doubt, refresh. No, well, such is the way of things. I will ask you to take on faith that I am telling you the truth. So in addition to the oblique strategies, I mean, this is a pretty trivial use case. You don't necessarily need the oblique strategies in your daily life, but I do frequently need to-do lists, and I often find myself in the kitchen cooking things. And so what begins with this pretty simple kind of canvas of notes and images, my copy of Farm grows in its own direction. It solves the problems I have that I care about. Your copy of Farm will solve your problems, or maybe it won't. Maybe it will make your problems worse, but that's not my business to decide. And I can share my solutions with you as easily as giving you a link. The lab can't read your email. The lab doesn't know if you use the software. Everything is BSD licensed and open source. It has no network infrastructure. There are no moving parts outside the system, and that's Farm. So we can talk a little bit about how this works. Farm is an Electron app. We use Electron because it's a runtime that gives us a web-like environment, but it also gives us Node, which means we can actually run sort of like full-fat network stack stuff. That's important because peer-to-peer systems rely on MDNS and DHT traversals and writing your own UDP packets and other things that browser vendors, I tell you, are very uncomfortable giving you access to. You can program in Farm with a VS Code extension. There's no reason why it has to be VS Code. I just happen to be running VS Code, and it is conveniently also an Electron app, which made it very easy for us to plug the two things together. There's someone on our team who hates VS Code so much he's been threatening to write a sort of a file system plugin. I wish him the best in that. He just hasn't got around to it. Yes, like so many of these projects. So the components which you saw, basically the whole canvas you're looking at is a system of nested web components. Web components are really cool because they give us an API and an isolation mechanism where we can take advantage of browser machinery to render these things. And so when you write the code for one of these web components with Elm, we pair it up with a data document, and then we send all that to the Elm compiler, which produces JavaScript, which is what the Electron app actually renders. That's also a reason we need Electron. Elm, disappointingly, is only available as a Haskell implementation, and therefore we can't run it in the browser. All of that data you see scrolling by, whether it's being generated on someone else's machine or your own, goes into this CRDT, which is a conflict-free replicated data type. And then those are written down into things called hypercores, which are sort of the underpinnings of DAT. We use DAT versus some of the other networks because DAT has stable names over time, so I can share a link with you once and you can continue to get updates. Now, this is fine, this is neat. I had fun making it, I had fun showing it to you just now. But there's a lot of new problems in this space, and once we begin to actually decentralize, we need to realize that we're not just building the old things again. It's not just, Instagram, but decentralized. A decentralized world has fundamentally different properties and has different values, and so our products will be different, our way of building will be different, and our way of thinking will be different. Some of these problems include sort of thinking about versions. If I can edit the software, how do I know what's happening when I give something to somebody else? If they can edit the software, how do they know what happens when they share back with me? If we're running different copies of the software but sharing data, right? These are problems that if you have a centralized control, you can kind of, yes, they're real. I know I worked in the cloud infrastructure myself. You can gloss over it with like a 5-minute downtime or a rolling deploy. But in a decentralized world, these problems are amplified. The decentralized world has different nouns and verbs. I keep having to explain to people on the team that there's no such thing as permission to write permission in the decentralized world. If you have the data, you can write to it. It's on your computer. Just like any file you download from the internet, once it reaches your hard drive, it's yours. I can just open up some zip file and write random bytes in the middle. Should I? Of course not. But I can. And this creates a new kind of class of problems. So what are the nouns and verbs that we need to talk about these, right? I think the Holochain people can sympathize with how difficult it is to create this new vocabulary. And it's clear that there's a lot of work to do here. IPFS team is struggling with pinning, and we're all trying to figure out what shape this thing has. Security is also fundamentally different. The DHT has all kinds of privacy violating properties, and not just sort of classic nation state threat vectors that we like to think about as like crypto nerds, but also just like bad people on the internet who want to harass you, and now that they've seen that you have a file pinned, they can track you around the internet and find out what coffee shop you're at because you're swarming from that IP. These are real serious problems, and we are doing ourselves no favors by glossing over them. Serious problems. Conversely, we have new opportunities. We can disseminate data to untrusted nodes with good encryption. We just need the right models and the right ways of thinking to discover them. And related to all of this, I love Beaker Browser, I love IPFS, I love DAT. when anyone can host a file, most of the time nobody is. And that's just the truth. So how can we start to think about what it means to be online and offline in new ways? How can we tell the difference between this file exists, but maybe not right now, you can't have it, or this file exists and you're getting it at 50 bytes a second because the only copy is at the bottom of a stairwell right now, or whatever those kinds of problems are. These are real problems. These require new kinds of thinking, and it's not just, you know, like a hardcore deep stack tech problem. These are UI problems, right? I hate it when I go to click on something and it moves. When I'm downloading data from a decentralized service, sometimes it's slow and the data just keeps sort of trickling in. I see this in all these systems. It's a problem. And of course, there are lots of great projects out there, and honestly, this would be like 5 slides, but I do really want to call attention to both Beaker Browser and PeterPad as people who are doing quite similar work. And also Mylano, which is a centralized cloud version of this sort of carved on a canvas, was very inspiring. I really like their product, and if you want something that does stuff like this that is actually usable, I highly recommend it. And of course, even Chorus have been looking at this end user programming stuff longer than we have, and Elm and everybody else are doing really good work. So that's Farm. I hope it has been interesting. I would love to take your questions, and if you're interested in trying it, it works often. If you check it out on GitHub and type yarn start, most of the time it works, and if it doesn't, you can hit me up on Twitter or IRC or somewhere else, and PVH, wherever you can find me. I also want to say thanks to Matt Tognetti, who worked on this project, and it's been a great collaboration.
Any questions for Farm? You can switch.
Maybe related questions. First of all, what is a hypercore? It's fun. And second, could you potentially run multiple farms, like locally? Or
sure. So a hypercore is it is a append-only log of changes where each new commit is signed by the previous commit. And those have their integrity maintained by a Merkle tree. It's essentially the storage component of the DAT tool.
And if you come next month, one of the main DAT people who work on hypercore is going to present on hypercores.
Other questions? Yeah.
That was great, thanks. It reminds me so much of Squeak.
Yeah.
And has that been influencing you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have the luxury of sitting around and like watching all the old demos and like dusting off all those old Indiana Jones crates and cracking them open and playing with things. So yeah, Squeak's definitely been an inspiration.
Squeak is an Alan Kay project from way back when, and I love how you've taken the component kind of visual idea. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you're looking for sort of like this one goes to 11 levels of modern day crazy. I highly recommend you check out Brett Victor's work at Dynamic Land.
Yes.
Other questions? I have a final question. Okay, so you had some funding to do this wildly non-commercial, interesting, cool stuff, but now your funding has run out.
All good things have their end.
All good things have their end. So what's next for you two and your collaborators at Ink and Switch?
Well, the problems have not gone away, and time will tell. Is that vague enough?
Yeah, that's pretty vague. So vague.
A vacation. How about that? I'm going to Disneyland.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who could really use someone with your principles, your values, your vision, your history. So.
I can be a real curmudgeon at times.
It's true.
Okay, so since I got you here, do you think you would ever go camping with a bunch of other decentralized web nerds? You know, like living in tents and cooking communally and talking deep thoughts.
I mean, camping's an easy sell for me.
So our vision is something like Burning Man early days meets Hackers Camp.
Okay, well, I don't think I'm cool enough for Burning Man.
Me either, so it's perfect for this.
I can certainly cook on the fire.
Okay, so we have found this beautiful piece of land near Pescadero.
I hear there are mushrooms.
There's mushrooms. Used to be the Campbell's mushroom farm where they would make cream of mushroom soup mushrooms at this farm. And
I'm
I
only a
guess
little bit disappointed.
there's 700, well, you know, that was the only kind of mushroom, but there's 700 acres of beautiful untouched land around it. And they've agreed, I believe, to work with us to create this camp. But it's like there's nothing there. There's no power. There's no sanitation. There's very little internet. So the folks from the Nesh communities have said they'll come in and they'll help build this Nesh, and we're going to bring in whatever power we can from this ISP and this. We're just going to try and do it.
Brewster put you up to this.
He sure did. It's been Brewster's dream. Because he said, you know, Eddie, there has to be a third path. You can go off and try and make a lot of money, get rich quick. You can be an academic and, live the ivory tower life, but there has to be a third path for people who want to use technology for good. And somehow, going and camping with you is going, seriously, talking about these things, getting out of our normal routine, beliefs can help us forge this new path. Like, has anyone ever been to Chaos Communication Camp in Germany? Right? So that's kind of our model.
I will offer.
On a smaller level, not thousands, but maybe hundreds.
I will offer a small thought, which is I think it's very difficult to align the incentives of highly funded companies with communities in the long run. I wish only the best to those of you who have to wrestle that dragon. I have been a part of VC-funded companies myself in the past, and I see the pressures that puts on the development of software. Farm is just BSD licensed software that we have dropped out the back door of our project, and you can play with it, but if it breaks, you can keep both halves.
What I would love to see is you raise some very fundamental questions about decentralization, not only incentives, but other things as well. Let's come and sit around a campfire and start to kind of talk those through.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Okay. July.
Yay!
We're kind of circulating 3 different dates, but the idea is Monday through Wednesday, if you come and help us build the camp, geodesic domes and all that stuff, you get to just be there for free for the rest of the time. Then Thursday through Sunday, we'll do the actual camp, and we're looking at either the 3rd, the 4th, or the 2nd week in July. And we're kind of just taking a poll of different people. So it's only an hour south, and I promise you it will be unlike any other thing you've done in your technical or non-technical lives. So please join us. Okay, so we meet every second Tuesday. If you want to talk, come to me and just enjoy for a little bit more. But as Brian will tell you, there are great bars down the street if you want to continue past our bedtime, which is 9. So thanks to the live stream folks, and you can see this on our YouTube live stream as well.
Well done, everybody.